I was 45 when my marriage ended, not with shouting, not with tears, but with a sentence spoken calmly in the middle of winter. Pack your things, this house is no longer yours. I remember the cold first, not the kind that hurts your skin, but the kind that settles inside your chest and stays there. That night did not begin like an ending, it began like any other ordinary evening. Dinner dishes drying on the rack, the television murmuring in the background, snow tapping lightly against the windows. I had spent the day doing what I always did, managing the home, answering emails for his business, making calls. He said he didn't have time for cleaning up problems he never wanted to acknowledge. I did not know that while I was folding laundry, my life was already being replaced. When the door opened, I expected of my husband, the man I'd been married to for over 20 years. Instead, I heard unfamiliar footsteps. There was a woman behind him. Young, confident, wearing my coat, not similar. Minaya didn't ask who she was. I already knew. He didn't introduce her. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked relieved, as if he had been waiting for this moment. As if the burden of pretending was finally gone. "This is Claire," he said casually. "She'll be staying here." The word "here" landed heavily, like it had weight, like it was meant to push me out. I stood there silently, hands still damp from washing dishes, watching the woman who had stepped into my life without hesitation. She looked around the house, my house, with curiosity, not guilt. I realized something then. She had already imagined herself here. She had already lived in this space in her mind, and I was the last thing left to remove. He told me it wasn't working anymore, that we had grown apart, that I wouldn't understand. He said it like he was explaining a delayed flight, not a betrayal. He waited for anger to rise, for my voice to shake, for my body to react. It didn't, because deep down I had known for a long time. I had known. Every time he stopped asking my opinion, every time he dismissed my concerns, every time he referred to the business as his, even though I built it beside him, I had been fading quietly for years. What surprised me was not that he cheated. What surprised me was how easily he erased me. He told me the house was in his name, the accounts were his, the decisions were his. He told me I should leave before things became difficult. That was the moment I understood this was not a fight. It was an eviction. Asked one question, just one. How long? He hesitated, then answered, "Long enough." That was enough for me. Went upstairs, opened the closet, pulled out a suitcase. I packed slowly, not because I was calm, but because rushing felt like item. I folded, reminded me of a version of myself I had outgrown, the woman who waited, who adjusted, who believed loyalty would be returned. I did not take jewelry, I did not take photos. I took only what I could carry without attachment. When I came back downstairs, she was sitting on my couch, scrolling through her phone, already comfortably. Stood by the door, holding it open, as if afraid I might change my mind. I stepped outside. The cold hit my face, immediately snowflakes melting against my skin. He didn't follow, he didn't say goodbye. The door closed behind me, and just like that, I was homeless, married, and alone. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, listening to the muffled sound of my life continuing without me. The laughter, the television, the warmth. I could have knocked, I could have screamed, I could have begged, but I didn't beg. To something shifted inside me, something quiet, something dangerous. I realized that night that the woman he thought he had defeated was only just beginning to understand her worth. I walked into the snow, not knowing where I would sleep, not knowing what would come next, only knowing one thing: I would not disappear the way he expected me to, and I would not forget this night. The night swallowed me quickly. The street was quiet, too quiet for a moment like this. Snow covered the sidewalks in a clean white layer, as if nothing ugly had ever happened. I stood there holding my suitcase, watching my breath rise and disappear, wondering how a life could end without making a sound. I had no plan, no destination, only movement. So I walked. Each step felt unreal, like I was observing myself from a distance. A woman in her 40s dragging a suitcase through the snow while her husband sat in warmth with another woman wearing her coati. Past houses glowing with yellow light, curtains drawn, families inside protected from the cold. No one noticed me. No one asked questions. That was the first lesson. Pain does not announce itself, it moves quietly. Just like I did. My phone vibrated once, then stopped. No messages, no missed calls. He wasn't checking on me, he wasn't worried. He believed I would break, that I would call, that I would come back. I didn't. He reached a small bus stop, an old bench covered in snow. I brushed it off and sat down. The cold seeped through my coat, the same coat she was now wearing inside my house. I thought about the years, about how young I had been when I married him, how I adjusted my life to fit his, how my name slowly disappeared from decisions. I remembered signing documents without reading them carefully, Because I trusted him, because he said it was easier that way. I remembered telling myself that love meant compromise, even when compromise always meant my bus arrived empty late. I got on without knowing where it was going. I watched the city slide past the windows, street lights closed, shops frozen, intersections. I wondered how many women were sitting somewhere like this at this exact moment, holding their lives in a single suitcase. I wondered how many of them had been told they were nothing without a man. The bus stopped at the last station. The driver looked at me kindly, didn't ask questions. I stepped off into unfamiliar streets. A cheap motel stood across the road, the kind with flickering lights and thin walls. I counted the cash in my wallet, not much, but enough for one night at the front desk. I gave my name. The woman didn't recognize it, didn't ask why my hands were shaking. The room was small, cleaned enough, cold. I sat on the bed, suitcase unopened. That was when it finally hit me. Had no income, no access to accounts, no legal power. I had built a life that belonged to someone else, and he had just taken it back. I lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come. My mind replayed his calm voice, his confidence, his certainty that I would fade quietly. That certainty bothered me more than the betrayal because it meant he had never seen me, not really. Sometime before dawn, I made a decision. I would not rush. I would not react. I would not confront. I would observe. I would listen. I would rebuild slowly. People who think you are weak reveal everything when you stop arguing. I reached for my phone, scrolled through old contacts, numbers I hadn't used in years, not to ask for help, not yet, just to remind myself that my life existed before him. I'll sigh. The snow kept falling, covering my footprints, erasing evidence of where I had been. Inside, I began planning where I was going. I didn't know how long it would take or what it would cost, but I knew this: he had thrown me out into the cold, believing I had nowhere to go. He was wrong, because I wasn't leaving. I was repositioning. Morning came without warmth. The motel window let in a pale gray light, flat, unforgiving. I sat up slowly, as if sudden movement might break whatever fragile balance I had left. My phone showed no messages, no missed calls. The silence confirmed what I already knew. I had been erased. Quickly I showered with lukewarm water, put on the same clothes from the night before, looked at my reflection. I looked older, not from age, from realization. For years I had been efficient, organized, invisible. Now invisibility felt like an advantage. I checked out of the motel before anyone asked questions, walked back into the street, suitcase lighter. Somehow I needed work. Any work, not for pride, for exercise. Started with places no one noticed: cafes, small offices, temporary agencies. I did not explain my situation. I learned long ago that explanations invite judgment. I said I was available, reliable, immediate. By afternoon, I had a temporary position: administrative support, short-term, low-pay. Perfect. I sat behind a desk, answering phones, sorting paperwork, listening. People talk when they think you don't matter. They talk about money, about mistakes, about shortcuts. They've talked about businesses like my husband's, mid-sized, privately owned, overextended. That word stayed with me. Overextended. I worked quietly, asked no personal questions, took notes in my head. At night, I returned to a smaller room, cheaper than the motel. Barefoot, I opened my suitcase for the first time. Inside were closed documents, a few notes, years of memory I hadn't realized I still carried. I began writing things down: dates, details, names, not accusations, just facts. I remembered how often my husband had asked me to handle things: client calls, vendor disputes, scheduling meetings he didn't attend. I remembered passwords, email structures, financial habits. I remembered where pressure existed, where corners had been cut. People think control belongs to the loudest voice. It doesn't. It belongs to the one who remembers weeks past. Winter deepened. I kept my head down, changed nothing. Publicly, I did not contact him. I did not ask for money. I did not post anything. That silence unsettled him. I knew because a mutual acquaintance mentioned his frustration casually. He didn't understand why I hadn't reacted, why I hadn't demanded anything. He thought I was ashamed. I let him think that one evening while filing old invoices at work. I recognized a name, a vendor, one I had negotiated with years ago, one I knew had unresolved issues. Felt something shift again, not excitement, not anger, clarity. I began reaching out quietly, not as his wife, not as an ex, as myself. Conversations reopened. Old concerns resurfaced. Patterns became visibly. Wasn't chasing revenge. I was mapping reality. Night I lay awake, not replaying betrayal, but assembling structure. This was not about destroying him. That would be loud. This was about allowing the truth to surface naturally, inevitably. He believed I had nothing, no leverage, no influence. That belief was his greatest weakness, because everything he built passed through my hands first. 10. I remembered all of it, closed my notebook, turned off the light outside. The city moved on. Unaware inside, I made a quiet promise I would not confront him until I was standing on solid ground, and when I did, I would not raise my voice. I would let facts speak, because people like him don't fear anger, they fear exposure. Time changed its meaning after that. Winter days stopped being something I endured, they became something I used. I settled into routines that required no explanation: work, sleep, observation. I rented a small room, paid in cash, left no trace. I didn't decorate, didn't unpack more than necessary. Temporary spaces teach you discipline at work. I was invisible by design, efficient, unremarkable. People rely on what works quietly. Months passed, I changed jobs twice, each move upward, each one closer to information. I learned which questions to ask, and more importantly, when not to ask them. I stopped thinking of him as my husband. I thought of him as a case study. Emotion distorts strategy. I tracked news related to his companies: subtle changes, delayed payments, new partnerships announced too loudly, overconfidence leaks through old contacts. I learned he was expanding, taking risks, trusting the wrong people. Men like him mistake silence for defeat. He had no idea I was watching. I marked time carefully: dates mattered, contracts renew, loans mature. Truth surfaces on schedules. One afternoon, I received an email from a former associate, someone who remembered my competency, needed help off the record, short term. The task was simple: review documentation, identify exposure. I recognized the structure immediately. It was his structure I accepted. For weeks, I worked through files quietly, thoroughly: patterns, repeated signatures, approvals, decisions he had rushed through, decisions I had warned him about once years ago. Why? Realized something important. His success had never been stable, it had been managed by me without my presence. The cracks had widened. I didn't celebrate that realization. I noted the goal was not collapse, the goal was alignment. One evening, as I reviewed a final report, I understood that timing was no longer theoretical, it was a year, almost exactly the same date, the same season, the kind of symmetry life rarely offers. I closed my laptop, sat still. I didn't feel revenge, I felt readiness. I knew what returning would mean, not emotionally, practically. I would not return as a wife or as a victim. I would return as someone withstanding. There was one final step left, one move that would make everything irreversibly. Sent a single email, short, professional, requesting a meeting. He signed it with my name, the one he had tried to erase. Then I waited. The meeting was scheduled without questions. That alone told me something: people do not agree to meet ghosts unless they are afraid of what the ghost remembers. I arrived early, not to make an impression, to observe. The building was familiar. Glass, steel, confidant. On the outside, I used to sit in those rooms, unacknowledged, uncredited. I signed in under my own name. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. Menery returned slowly. He arrived late, as expected. He stopped when he saw me, not because he was surprised, but because he was unprepared. We did not shake hands. I sat first, placed my bag beside the chair, opened a folder. I did not speak immediately. Silence makes people feel spacey. Asked why I was there, his voice controlled, tight around the edges. I told him I had been reviewing documents, historical ones. That word unsettled him. Historical. I reminded him of things he had forgotten. To vendor negotiations, payment structures, fallback losses. I didn't accuse, I referenced. I didn't threaten, I explained. I watched his confidence thin. He tried to interrupt. I let him. Then continued. I showed him timelines, not opinions. His signature appeared often, but the preparation behind those signatures had been. I reminded him how many accounts had been opened on advice he had ignored. Later, I reminded him who had built the systems he still relied on. He leaned back, crossed his arms, a defense posture. I told him something he didn't expect. I told him I didn't want the hows or apologies or explanation. Wanted accuracy. He asked what that meant. I slid a second folder across the table. Inside were summaries, clean, unemotional. Exposure, risk, inevitability. I explained that truth doesn't need revenge, it only needs time, and his time was approaching. The room felt smaller. He asked how I had access to this information. He reminded him that I had always had access, he just stopped noticing. He asked what I wanted. I stood, not dramatically, purposefully. I told him I would be returning not to the marriage but to the narrative. He told him that in 1 year, everything he believed was secure would be reviewed by people who asked different questions. I closed the folder, left it on the table. I walked out, without waiting for a response. In the elevator, I felt something close to relief, not victory. Release. Outside, the city moved as usual. So he would spend the night reviewing documents, calling advisors, pretending control. He would spend it sleeping, because the foundation had already shifted, and buildings don't fall when you push them, they fall when what holds them together is exposed. I returned on a day that looked ordinary. Clear sky, cold air, no warning signs. That is how consequences arrive quietly. I didn't go back to the house first. I went to the places that mattered: offices, banks, meeting rooms with neutral walls. People greet me differently this time, with caution, with recognition. Names had resurfaced. Documents had circulated. Truce moves faster once it is acknowledged by. The time I stood in front of the house, the one I had been thrown out of, the power dynamic had already shifted. The door opened slowly. He looked older, not from time, from stress. She was behind him, watching, measuring. Eyes stepped inside without asking. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The furniture was the same. The silence was nutty. Didn't sit. I didn't remove my coat. He told him the review had begun, that timelines were no longer flexible. He tried to speak. I raised a hand, not to silence him, to signal structure. I told him that the house, the business, the accounts were under evaluation, that what he believed was ownership was actually dependency. I didn't mention betrayal all winter. All the suitcases. Details were irrelevant. Now she asked who I was. I looked at her briefly. I told her I was the reason the lights stayed on long before she arrived. She said nothing after that. I handed him one final document, a notice, formal, unavoidably. Told him this was not punishment. It was correction. I told him I wasn't taking anything back. I was taking my name forward. He asked if this was revenge. I answered, honesty is emotional. This was accounting. I turned to leave at the door. I paused, not for him, for myself. I told him one last thing, that the night he threw me into the cold, he believed the story was over. He was wrong. That night was only the beginning. I stepped outside, did not look back behind me. The house stood quietly, waiting for the truth to finish its work. The fallout did not explode. It spread quietly, methodically, the kind of collapse that happens in boardrooms. Not headlines. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed, then cancelled. People who once praised his confidence now questioned his decisions. I did not attend those meetings. I didn't need to. Truth does its best work when no one is performing. She left before the end, not dramatically, not with accusation. She packed in silence, the same way I had. He did not stop her. Men like him never did. They believe departure is temporary until it isn't. The house became quieter, then empty. I heard these details indirectly from people who didn't realize they were updating me. He began calling, not off, not desperately, carefully. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to negotiate. The business lost contracts. Not all at once, just enough to make confidence impossible. Banks ask different questions than spouses. They don't accept reassurance. They ask for proof. He no longer had. The narrative changed slowly. Publicly, he wasn't exposed. He was reclassified from reliable to risky. That label is difficult to remove. I passed him once on a sidewalk, unexpected. He looked at me. Sachin. I did not slow down. I had already said everything that mattered. There was no satisfaction in watching him shrink. Only clarity. I had not destroyed him. I had simply stopped protecting him, and without that protection, reality had taken over. At night I slept well, not because he suffered, but because I no longer carried his weight. I understood something then. Justice is not about balance. It is about release. I had released myself. What happened to him belonged to him. The story was nearly finished, not with punishment, but with distance. Asterisks. The story did not end with an apology or with regret. He never asked for forgiveness, and I never expected him to. Some endings are not meant to be. Should I moved into a small apartment, bright, quiet. He chose it myself. Every detail, every decision that mattered more than size. I did not replace what I lost. I redefined it, worked under my own name. Not hidden, not borrowed. People began to recognize it again, not because I demanded recognition, but because consistency speaks. I stopped checking on him, stopped asking through others. His story continued without me, as it should. Freedom is not watching someone fall. It is realizing you no longer care if they stand. Sometimes I thought back to that winter night, the suitcase, the snow, the closed door. No longer felt cold when I remembered it. Felt distance. That is how you know you are healed. Not when it stops hurting, but when it stops defining you. I learned that love without respect is not loyalty, it is erasure, and silence is not weakness, it is choice. I did not take revenge. I took responsibility for myself, for my future, for the life I postponed. If you are listening to this and you are standing in a place you never chose, this walking away quietly is sometimes the strongest move you will ever make. Everyone who leaves loses. Some of us finally arrive